At one of the most elite private schools in Sanford, where hallways were filled with students from the wealthiest families, Ethan Wallace was no different from the rest. Privileged, entitled, and oblivious to the struggles of those beneath his status. Admired for his family's immense wealth, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. Among the school's staff was Isabel Moreno, a quiet, hard-working woman who had taken a job as a janitor to support herself. She had been with the school for only a short time, yet to students like Ethan, she was invisible. Just another worker in the background. Ethan hardly ever noticed Isabel, except for the rare occasions when he felt the urge to throw a passing insult. To him, she was nothing more than someone cleaning up after him and his classmates. One afternoon, as Isabel carried a heavy stack of textbooks while trying to clean, she lost her balance slightly, sending a few books tumbling to the floor. The sound echoed through the hallway, drawing attention, including Ethan's. With a smirk, he walked over, his voice dripping with condescension. "Nice job, Isabel. Maybe you should work on your coordination. People like you can't afford mistakes, you know." His classmates chuckled, entertained by the humiliation. Isabel's face burned with embarrassment, but she kept her head down, kneeling to pick up the books. Ethan wasn't done. "Maybe you should stick to scrubbing floors. That's probably the only thing you're good at." More laughter followed. Isabel didn't respond. She simply picked up the books and continued her work in silence. To Ethan, it was a trivial moment, a fleeting exertion of his superiority. But to Isabel, it was a sharp reminder of the divide that separated them, not just in wealth, but in how the world perceived them. Days passed, and the incident faded from Ethan's mind as quickly as it had happened. He continued his life, untouched by the consequences of his actions. But then something happened. Something that would shift everything he thought he knew. That afternoon, as students rushed out of the building at the end of the school day, Ethan was surprised to see his father, William Wallace, waiting for him at the front gate. It was a rare sight. Usually a driver or one of the household staff picked him up. But what caught Ethan's attention wasn't just his father's presence. It was Isabel, frozen near the entrance, staring at him with wide eyes as if she had seen a ghost. And then something even stranger happened. His father saw Isabel, and for a split second his face went pale with shock. But then something deeper appeared in his eyes, an emotion Ethan had never seen in his father before. Taking a hesitant step forward, William Wallace spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Isabel, is that really you?" Ethan, caught in the middle of this unexpected exchange, frowned in confusion. "Wait, you know her?" His father didn't respond immediately. He was still staring at Isabel, as if seeing someone from a past life. Isabel's voice trembled as she finally spoke. I didn't know. I didn't realize. It's been so long." William took another step forward, emotion thick in his voice. "I've been looking for you for years. I made a promise to your father that I would take care of you, but then you disappeared. I tried everything to find you." At that moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan stood frozen, struggling to process the weight of what he had just heard. He looked from his father to Isabel, his mind racing. What was happening? Why was his father speaking as if Isabel was important? More than just a janitor? As the pieces started coming together, William Wallace finally explained a story that Ethan had never known, a truth that would shake the very foundation of his world. Years ago, William had built his business empire alongside Miguel Thompson, a brilliant entrepreneur and his most trusted partner. Together, they had created the immense wealth that Ethan's family now enjoyed. They had been inseparable, working side by side to turn dreams into reality. But then, tragedy struck. Miguel had passed away in a sudden accident, leaving behind his only daughter, Isabel. Ethan's father had promised Miguel in his final moments that he would look after Isabel, ensuring she was cared for. But after Miguel's death, Isabel had vanished. She had left home, unaware that her father had built an empire, one that was meant to give her a new life. She never knew that her father had arranged for her future, and in the chaos following his passing, she had ended up struggling to survive alone. "I searched for you," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find you. I had only one old photo, but I recognized you the moment I saw you. I never gave up hope, but I feared the worst. And now, here you are, working at this school. I can't believe it." Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling. The girl he had belittled, the girl he had insulted without a second thought, was the daughter of his father's closest friend. Not just that. She was someone who was meant to inherit a significant portion of the wealth Ethan had always assumed would be his. Isabel, her voice trembling, finally spoke. "I didn't know. I didn't know what happened to my father. I thought he had nothing left. I had no idea he had built something, that he had become successful. I didn't know you were looking for me." William shook his head, regret deep in his eyes. "I failed you, Isabel. I should have found you sooner. But now that you're here, we can make things right." The weight of the situation hit Ethan like a crashing wave. He had spent weeks mocking a girl who, in reality, deserved the life he lived far more than he ever did. He had treated her as though she were beneath him, when in truth she was the rightful heir to a fortune that even he had never imagined. His father turned to him, his voice solemn. "Ethan," he said quietly, "Isabel is entitled to a significant part of what we've built. This was her father's wish for her. She is as much a part of this legacy as you are." Ethan's stomach churned with guilt and shame. He had been arrogant, cruel, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. Isabel wasn't just a school cleaner. She was someone who rightfully belonged to the world he had taken for granted. But what happened next shocked Ethan more than anything. Despite everything, Isabel did not react with anger or resentment. She didn't demand justice for the way Ethan had treated her. Instead, she looked at him with an expression of quiet understanding. "I know why you treated me the way you did," she said gently. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know my story. But now you do, and I hope you learned from this, that people are more than what they seem on the surface." Ethan, overwhelmed by guilt, could barely find the words to respond. He simply nodded, humbled by her kindness. "I've learned a lot from my experiences," Isabel continued. "Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never expect. But the most important thing I've learned is that everyone deserves respect, no matter where they come from or what they look like. Wealth doesn't make someone better than anyone else." Her words cut deep. Ethan had lived in a bubble of privilege, believing that money and status made him superior. But standing before Isabel, he realized just how wrong he had been. William, too, was visibly moved. He placed a hand on Isabel's shoulder, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've reminded us all of something important today, Isabel. The value of kindness, of empathy, of seeing beyond ourselves." From that day forward, Isabel was no longer just a staff member at the school. She became part of Ethan's family, the family she had been separated from for so long. Ethan, ashamed of his past behavior, made a conscious effort to change. He treated Isabel with the respect she had always deserved, not because of her wealth, but because he had finally learned the lessons she had so graciously taught him. And as for Isabel, she embraced her new life with humility and grace, never forgetting where she had come from. She became a symbol of resilience and compassion, not just to Ethan, but to everyone around her. Ethan found himself haunted by the way he had treated her. What once seemed like harmless teasing now felt like venomous cruelty. But Isabel, despite having every reason to hold a grudge, carried on with grace. And in the end, that was what changed Ethan the most. He had been humbled, not by punishment, but by forgiveness. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be a better person. She was kind, always polite, and never made Ethan feel lesser for what had transpired between them. It was this quiet dignity that left him even more unsettled. She could have demanded retribution, could have reveled in her newfound position of power, but instead she chose understanding. The contrast between her and his own entitled behavior gnawed at him. One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his room, he made a decision. He had to talk to Isabel, not just to apologize, though that was certainly long overdue, but to understand her better. It wasn't enough to just recognize his mistake. He needed to learn from it. He needed to confront his own ignorance. The next morning, Ethan approached Isabel while she was tending to some plants in the school courtyard. She had taken up gardening as a way to clear her mind, and she looked peaceful, her fingers gently brushing the leaves of the plants. "Isabel." Ethan's voice was hesitant, unsure. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Ethan," she acknowledged with a soft smile. "How are you?" Ethan scratched the back of his neck, feeling awkward. I wanted to talk to you. Do you have a moment?" Isabel straightened up and nodded. "Of course." They walked over to a bench in the courtyard and sat in silence for a few moments. Ethan struggled to find the right words. This was harder than he had imagined. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with guilt. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About the way I treated you," Ethan began, his words shaky. "And I want to say I'm sorry. I was awful to you, and I had no right to say the things I said. I didn't know who you were, but that's no excuse. It doesn't matter who you are. No one deserves to be treated like that." Isabel listened quietly, her eyes soft but serious. Ethan continued, the words spilling out faster now that he had started. "I've been living in this bubble my whole life. I never had to think about what it's like for someone who doesn't have what I have. I assumed things about you because of how you looked and the job you had, and that's so messed up. I don't even know how to begin making it right." Isabel stayed silent for a moment, letting Ethan's apology hang in the air. Then she spoke, her voice calm and understanding. "I appreciate your apology, Ethan. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, but more than that, it's important to understand why it happened in the first place. You're right. It shouldn't matter who I am or what my background is. We should treat everyone with respect, no matter their story. But it's not just you. A lot of people make assumptions based on appearances. It's something I've dealt with my whole life." Ethan looked down at his hands, ashamed. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. Isabel smiled gently. "That's because you haven't had to. People like me, we're constantly aware of how the world sees us. It's something you learn to navigate, but it's not easy. And when people like you, people who have influence, power, choose to use that power to put others down, it has real consequences." Ethan's heart sank. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just didn't think." "I know," Isabel said kindly, "but now you do, and that's what matters." Ethan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Isabel wasn't just forgiving him, she was giving him the chance to grow, to become better. It was a gift he hadn't expected, and it humbled him even more. As they talked, Ethan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. He spoke about the pressure he felt to live up to his family's expectations, about how wealth had isolated him from understanding other people's struggles. Isabel, in turn, shared more about her life, about losing her father, about the pain of growing up without knowing where she truly belonged. The more they talked, the more Ethan realized how much they had in common. Despite the vast differences in their lives, they had both been shaped by their circumstances, but while Ethan had been shielded by privilege, Isabel had been tempered by hardship. Over the next few weeks, Ethan made a conscious effort to change. He became more involved in the school's outreach programs, volunteering to help with initiatives that supported underprivileged students. He began to see the world through a different lens, one that wasn't tinted by wealth and status. His friends noticed the change in him, and though some teased him for it, Ethan didn't care. He was starting to understand what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. Meanwhile, Isabel had become more than just a worker at the school. She had been welcomed into Ethan's family, though it was still a bit awkward for him at times. His father, William, had taken her under his wing, treating her like the daughter he had promised to protect all those years ago. Isabel had started to explore the opportunities her inheritance afforded her, but she did so with the same humility she had always shown. She didn't flaunt her wealth or use it to elevate herself above others. Instead, she chose to use it to help those who, like her, had been overlooked and underestimated. And as Ethan watched her, he realized that true wealth wasn't about money or status. It was about character. It was about how you treated others when no one was watching. And it was about the lessons you learned when life gave you the chance to be better than you were before. She used it to give back, supporting causes that were close to her heart. One evening, Ethan's father threw a grand party at their estate to celebrate Isabel's return to the family. It was an opulent affair, with all the influential people in their circle invited. Ethan, who had never been particularly fond of these kinds of gatherings, found himself standing on the sidelines, watching as Isabel effortlessly mingled with the guests. But what struck him most wasn't just the fact that she now belonged to this world. It was the way she carried herself. Isabel was gracious, warm and welcoming to everyone she met, regardless of their status or wealth. She treated the staff with the same kindness as she did the guests, never once letting her newfound position change who she was. As Ethan observed her, a sense of admiration grew within him, not for himself, but for Isabel. She had endured so much, and yet remained unshaken by the trappings of wealth and privilege. She was the kind of person he aspired to be, someone who saw the value in others, no matter their circumstances. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, Ethan found Isabel sitting alone in the garden, gazing up at the stars. He hesitated for a moment before joining her, taking a seat quietly beside her. "You've come a long way," Isabel said, breaking the silence. "I can see the change in you." Ethan smiled, though there was still a trace of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm trying," he admitted, "but I still have a lot to learn." Isabel nodded. "We all do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both reflecting on the journey they had been on. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice filled with sincerity. "Isabel, I just want to say thank you. Not just for forgiving me, but for teaching me. You've changed the way I see the world." Isabel turned to him, her expression soft. "You've changed too, Ethan, and that's all that matters." As they sat together under the vast, starlit sky, Ethan realized what true wealth really was. Not money, not status, but the connections they forged with others. Isabel had shown him that, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly rich. In the end, it wasn't about inheritance or wealth. It was about the lessons learned, the growth experienced, and the bonds formed. And for Ethan, the greatest gift he had ever received wasn't the fortune he had once taken for granted. It was the chance to become a better person, to be part of a family that valued kindness, empathy, and love above all else. As time went on, Isabel became a permanent part of their lives, not just as someone who had inherited wealth, but as a true member of the family. She and William worked together to honor her late father's legacy, investing in projects that supported underprivileged communities. Ethan, now an advocate for change, used his platform to raise awareness about social issues and challenge the stereotypes he had once so carelessly perpetuated. And though their journey had been difficult, it had led them to a place of understanding, respect, and, most importantly, love.